Can't tell you the day nor the hour, but the current estimates that we have, best that we can do with our analysis is, I can't tell you the day or the hour, but this 12 to 18 month period, all the factors are aligning to this being a very difficult time. And I think it's why Putin's being very aggressive with trying to get a deal right now. I mean, because he wants to evade. He would prefer to not have to deal with it and fight it head on. He would prefer to sort of evade it with with a ceasefire, because as soon as there's a ceasefire or an operational pause or an armistice, whatever you want to call it, the key thing is the tempo goes down and the Russians stop losing what they're losing. Then he can evade it. The war still remains dynamic. It is not hopelessly stalemated. I would note that in positive news, the Russian offensive operations around their main area of advance, which is in Donetsk Oblast near Pokrovsk, is slowed down in recent weeks. Really starting in late 2024, around November, December, but also continuing into January and February, the tempo of Russian gains around the outskirts of Pokrovsk have slowed down. The Ukrainians have engaged in some tactical counterattacks to alleviate pressure on that Russian salient coming up around southern outskirts of Pokrovsk, and that's promising. It seems that campaign is slowly petering out. Their daily rates of advance are slowing down, so this is a positive sign. I'd also note for you that it seems like in 2025, the Russians might begin prioritizing operations to intensify their attacks slightly to the north of Pokrovsk. We've seen some indications that the Russians are redeploying the units that were fighting in the southern part of Donetsk near Vuhledar, and also some units that were previously in the Pokrovsk-Kurakhova area that they're redeploying towards Toretsk and towards the Chasiv Yar area. And this might suggest that the Russians might be preparing to intensify operations against what we call Ukraine's fortress belt of cities. Those large-scale, heavily fortified, long-time cities like Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinivka, etc. And we might see the Russians in the summer campaign season attempt to slog it out there. But again, we're not forecasting any major operational breakthroughs. It would likely be more relatively slow warfare of a mostly positional nature, grinding attritional warfare. Neither side has figured out how to restore operational maneuver to the battlefield. Now, as for the 2025 vulnerabilities, I think you've touched on here a very important discussion that we should have, which is the United States, I think, actually holds a lot of cards, and Ukraine holds a lot of cards in shaping what a peace deal, what a termination of the conflict looks like with Russia. Russia has serious problems on the horizon. They are not acutely affecting Russia today, right now. But Putin in 2022 and over the last 2 years has sowed the seeds of instability because he has made decisions that really mismanaged a numerically and qualitatively superior economy, a larger military, and a larger population base and demographics, to the point where actually a protracted war and further continuation of the war under the current terms becomes increasingly unstable. I'll touch on these very briefly. I think we've talked about this before, but the burn rate in Ukraine, I mean, these gains that the Russians have made have been absolutely unsustainable. In raw numbers, from Avdiivka, which fell in February of 24, to the current front line in southern Pokrovsk, Russia's main effort, the Russians advanced a grand total of 55 kilometers over the course of about 14 months. They lost over 5 armored divisions worth of equipment, over 500 tanks, over 1,000 armored personnel carriers, tens of thousands of troops. This is not a worth it trade. If you just sort of look at the metrics, a division should be able to cover a frontage of this many kilometers and be reasonably expected to advance this far. That's not a good pace. It's actually quite glacial. And, for the Russians to be able to seize all of Ukraine, I don't think that's necessarily what the Russians are going to do. But at the current tempo, it takes them 83 years, assuming they can maintain the current intensity, which is not the case given how we see them petering out around Pokrovsk. Russia's defense industrial base does not produce new tanks at scale with new serial production. They crank out there's one factory that does it, Uralvagonzavod, and it cranks out between maybe 30 tanks a month or up to 90 tanks a year. The estimates vary, but that's the range. Russian tanks that we see continuously getting destroyed on Ukraine's battlefields, those are Soviet-era tanks taken from Soviet-era long-term storage, which is a finite resource, and which, according to the best open-source geospatial intelligence, indicates that they're going to run critically low on these infantry fighting vehicles and tanks in about a year, provided the tempo continues. Let's talk about how they actually get the men into those vehicles. Putin made a huge mistake in resourcing this war. In 2022, he should have used the monopoly of violence the Russian government has over its people to coerce hundreds of thousands or millions of Russians to go fight in Ukraine. But Putin didn't do that. Putin cares about his regime stability and his promises to the Russian people. Putin instead created a social contract with the Russians, which is, I will not coerce you to fight in Ukraine. I will bribe you I will pay you off to go fight in Ukraine. And so I will pay you money with these sign-on bonuses and financial incentives to voluntarily go, so that when you're killed or wounded, you don't complain, because that was part of the deal. That was a tremendous mistake, because that could work for a short-term war, a 3-day military operation, even maybe a year or 2 year long war, but it's not work for a 3 or 4 or 5 year protracted war, because it destroys the Russian economy. The liquidity portion of Russia's sovereign wealth fund has decreased precipitously since 2022. Before the war, the liquidity portion was about $96 billion, if I remember correctly. It's now down to closer to $46 billion, and economists here in Washington, some of them forecast that their liquid reserves will run out by the end of this year, all things kept the same. Putin can continue paying off people to go fight in Ukraine, but people are a limited resource too, and the number of humans that are actually either economically desperate enough to take that deal, or the people that realize that actually most people that take that deal end up getting killed relatively quickly, is growing. And so what we see now is that actually the recruiter is responsible for getting the 30 to 45,000 Russians per month that the Russians recruit. They're starting to complain to Moscow, and they're starting to say, hey, we're not able to meet the quotas anymore. Can we please lower these sort of things? I read the North Koreans joining the fight back in November, December as an indication that the Russians are looking for alternative sources to get boots on the ground. And so Putin will, at the current loss rates, he will have to call another round of mobilization like he did in fall 22. But that's not a get out of jail free card, because the Russians are also trying to manage a labor deficit of 1 million workers right now. And so you can certainly mobilize more people, but that's going to come at the expense of, you're going to have to pay them off. You're going to have to pay off their families when they're killed or wounded. And you're going to be robbing Peter and the domestic economy to pay Paul for taking people into fight in Ukraine. And so really, the approach should be, look, the longer we protract this war, the closer the Russians run to running out of steam with their Soviet-era vehicles, the closer they run out to their liquid currency reserves running critically low, the more acute their labor shortage problems become, as the Russians continue to lose 30 to 45,000 casualties per month. And this will force Putin to have to make some very difficult decisions. I don't know how he's going to mitigate it. I'm sure he'll find ways to mitigate, but he will be forced to make decisions and make trade-offs. And really, look, trying to end the war and conclude it right now, before these factors can really mature to a place where it puts the Russians into a binder, would be a mistake. I mean, we can really extract a good deal the longer we keep the Ukrainians in the fight, and that also includes not just the United States keeping them in the fight, but the Europeans keeping them in the fight. I mean, we're at the point now where every day counts. It's the closer you drive the Russians to this hard place, and every day that the Russians get the deal sooner than they want, then they get to evade this potential bundle of problems.
That's really interesting, because we've spoken so many times, George, about the issues that Russia have, whether it's manpower or supplies or the economic problems facing the Russian economy. And sort of, when will the crunch point come? And in your view, if the fighting continues further into 2025, certainly towards the end of 2025, that crunch point is very soon.
I can't tell you, sort of like, when's the second of Christ coming? I can't tell you the day nor the hour, but the current estimates that we have, best that we can do with our analysis is, I can't tell you the day or the hour, but this 12 to 18 month period, all the factors are aligning to this being a very difficult time. And I think it's why Putin's being very aggressive with trying to get a deal right now. I mean, because he wants to evade. He would prefer to not have to deal with it and fight it head on. He would prefer to sort of evade it with a ceasefire. Because as soon as there's a ceasefire or an operational pause or an armistice, whatever you want to call it, the key thing is the tempo goes down and the Russians stop losing what they're losing. then he can evade it.
I mean, it's interesting. Obviously, sitting in Washington from your perspective, George, you can see that. You can recognise that the fundamental weakness of the Russian position. And yet, as we know, there's a certain man sitting in another office in Washington who sees it very differently and seems to believe that the Russians are either in a stronger position than they obviously are, or whether he just sympathises with them for whatever reason. How frustrating do you find it as someone who can identify the underlying weakness of the Russian position, that at the moment it appears the Trump administration doesn't seem to see it that way?
So, look, I think the Trump administration, they want to have a peace deal, which I think is in principle a good thing. Everyone wants the fighting to stop. I would prefer that it's a version of the fighting where it stops, where the Russians don't win in part or in whole. But in principle, terminating this conflict is a good thing. We should terminate it on terms that advance American interests. Selfishly, I say that as an American, and we should advance it on terms that advance Ukraine's national security interests, because those are deeply interlinked with America's national security interests. And we should terminate on terms that actually do not further Russian national interests, because the Russians are adversaries. Now, I think this administration, I think Donald Trump, particularly on the campaign trail, I mean, it's not a particularly novel idea to say we should take politicians when they're stumbling on the campaign trail and then politicians when they're actually in power and governing. They're very different people, and that's not unique to our current president. He, to a fault on the campaign trail, was talking about how quickly he would get a peace deal in place. He said it would be done before the inauguration was complete. You'd get it done on day one. He's currently saying it'll be done within 100 days or within, like 6 months or something. And this is positive. This is good, because he's realizing that actually these are complex issues, that actually a better deal can be made as time progresses. And so obviously it didn't happen before Inauguration Day. It didn't happen on day one. We're now, a month into it. So if he said it was going to take him 100 days, he's basically 1/3 through that. Like, I think as he studies the facts and gets, back briefed and read into all the dynamics, he can, and as they send the negotiators to Riyadh to go talk to the Russians and stuff, they can actually realize that, oh, actually, Putin's not interested in negotiating, because words matter. Negotiation implies both sides make concessions and you come to this middle point. But the Russians have explicitly said, even just yesterday, on the anniversary of the war, Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and the deputy Russian foreign minister, Ryabkov, they articulated that they're not interested in anything other than their initial demands. Ryabkov says that they want to get to the root causes of what caused this in the first place, which is they don't believe Ukraine should be a sovereign country that can choose to join its own alliances and have freedom of association. And they don't want other NATO states like Poland and Lithuania and Latvia to be within the alliance. And they said, if we don't figure these root causes of the conflict out, then we can't have a deal. And so what Putin is presenting to us and what he presented to Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff and the other negotiators in Riyadh last week was essentially, here's the deal. Moscow gets everything we've been demanding since 2021. The United States makes a series of concessions. The Ukrainians get completely screwed over by this deal, and then we'll shake hands and call it a negotiation. That's not a negotiation. Actually, the Russians should be forced to make some concessions, and I think the Trump administration is realizing that actually a quick deal, a good deal, the kind of deal that he was promising in terms of its speed and rapidity on the campaign trail, we shouldn't allow the quick deal to be the enemy of the best deal. And the best deal is a deal where we let the Russians mature in this problem set and then use it on them to force them to make concessions. Otherwise, there's no deal. And also, there's principles. I mean, unfortunately, Steve Witkoff just the other day on Sunday gave an interview with CNN where he talked about how the 2022 Istanbul Accords would have been the basis of he called them guideposts. It would be a guidepost for the new negotiations. And unfortunately, if you interrogate the substance of those Istanbul Accords, it cannot serve as the basis of a negotiation. There's a reason why it failed in 2022. Because the terms are completely unacceptable. And ISW just published a fact sheet about those accords yesterday, in fact.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.